make sure that this is working.
All right, I'm on Facebook.
Capital D.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like we're live. So thanks everyone. We're just testing everything and making sure that this is all working properly so we can get started.
It's riveting TV.
Isn't it though? I'm sure everyone is so excited for these tech tests that we do. All right, I think we're all set. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this installment of the Washington Stay Home Society. We're joined today by Ben Thompson, who is going to do a very special Guts and Glory Washington State edition for our talk tonight. So thank you for joining us for that.
Thank you so much for having me.
And if you've been following along with us, we have been hosting this whole series, the Washington Stay Home Society, all of these virtual programs brought to you while we can't be together at the Washington State History Museum in Tacoma. So thank you for joining us for this program tonight. I want to begin by acknowledging that the Washington State Historical Society is located on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people who have stewarded the land throughout the generations, and we want to pay our respect to their elders, both past and present. So to get us started, like I mentioned, the Washington Stay Home Society is just a chance to connect with all of you while we can't be together. You can see that link right there on our page. You can visit our website and see all of our upcoming Washington Stay Home Society programs. We're just about to finish our first round of programming, and it looks like we'll be continuing this virtual series for some time in the future. So stay tuned for additional programs to be posted there shortly. If you are so inclined, you're really enjoying this series, please also consider donating and supporting the Washington State Historical Society. The link is right there where you can follow along to donate, and be sure in the line to say that you attended some of our programs so that we know that you've been watching with all of us. So we're about to get started. I want to say that through this presentation, feel free to write questions or interact in the chat function. We have Len, who's on our programs team, who will be fielding all of those questions. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll pose those questions to Ben. But now on to the main event. I want to introduce Ben, who has written 12 books on various awesome historical subjects, including the Badass, which I have my own copy here, which I need Ben to sign when we can actually see each other in person again. Guts and Glory and the Epic Fails series. He's been on a popular history blog for over 15 years, and that website is called badassoftheweek.com. You should definitely follow that. He has appeared on all sorts of television programs on channels like the History Channel, Discovery, the American Heroes Channel, and the Urban Film Channel, and has been the primary narrator for all 6 episodes of AHC's Hardcore Hero series. We were first lucky enough to meet Ben through our book fair that we hosted at the Washington State History Museum, and then invited him to come and speak at our History After Hours series, which was Washington in Space. And Ben gave this amazing introduction about the overall history of epic fails in aeronautical exploration, if you will. And we were all in stitches, including the Boeing historian, who super enjoyed the talk. So Ben, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it was a little bit intense when we were doing that talk because I kind of have my own little setup that I do. And then it's kind of just really kooky and frenetic. And then you were like, let me introduce to you. These are the guys. It's like this group of old guys. These are the guys that built the Lunar rover. And I'm like, oh, no, I hope you're going to like this. So,
and
okay.
they did, and they were amazing. So thank you.
Yeah, they were awesome. They were all super cool, and it was really great to get to meet them, and they were all just really friendly, and it was a really great event, and I'm looking forward to doing more of them in the future, and also to being able to go outside of my house and go do other things that are not sit in my living room. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see if I got this. Are you seeing me? All right, I'm getting a thumbs up. So, okay, I am going to attempt this. I've never done one of these talks over virtual thing before. So if it's terrible, then you should just blame the quarantine. Okay, start off with an Alice in Chains lyric because of course I have to start off with a grunge lyric in order to begin this talk. Okay, focus. Hello, hi, my name is Ben. I'm a famous author. I wrote a bunch of books. Some of them are in languages that I don't even actually speak. And today I'm going to be talking about a couple of them. I'm going to be talking about basically my Guts and Glory series, which is where I take great heroes from various parts of history and I cut their life stories down to 4 or 5 pages. And I just pretty much tell the good parts, the violence, destruction, murder, mayhem, chaos, killing, all the stuff that I enjoy as being a person with the mentality of a 14-year-old boy. So we're going to do that for Washington State today, and which means we're going to get rid of the Vikings and the American Revolution because we don't really have any history of that out here. I'm going to replace them with Nirvana albums, I guess. Okay, so here's me. I didn't know if I was going to be visible, but I did want to say that this picture was taken in Ireland and I'm originally from Florida, but I did want you to have photographic evidence that I do own a Seattle Mariners shirt. And since my favorite baseball team hasn't played a meaningful game in the 13 years I've been living in this state, I think this makes me an honorary Washingtonian. So I'm just going to go with it. There's the beard and sunglasses. We'll move on from there. So we're going to start with Washington State circa 1600 or something. This is what people thought maps looked like back in the old days before anybody knew what maps looked like. And so we're like, I guess here-ish. Yeah, I don't know. This is like before Google Maps when people were kind of just drawing whatever freehand. They kind of forgot about Alaska. They give Newfoundland like a little bit extra girth there. But what we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk you through from this to the present day. So it's going to start with this, and we're going to get up to like the modern Washington that we know and love, where I can't afford to rent a closet with 6 roommates. So story kind of starts with the Northwest Passage. And can you see my mouse? Are you seeing that? Okay. All right. So Northwest Passage was the idea that basically anybody that was important in the world in 1600 lived over here in Europe, and they wanted to plunder and pillage everything that was over here on the West Coast. But they really got tired of going around the bottom or going around Africa past whatever is out here to the east. I forget. So the idea was that, remember that map that didn't have Alaska? The idea was that maybe there was some way to like just go through here somehow. There's not. The guy who got the closest was this guy, Henry Hudson, who got out into Hudson Bay. He thought he was a lot closer than he was. He wouldn't let it go. His guys were like, dude, you're not close. We're nowhere near getting all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So eventually he annoyed them so much that they put him on a raft and just let him sail out into Hudson Bay. And he's probably still there. All right, we're going to start the story with a guy named Juan de Fuca. Juan de Fuca was actually a Greek. His grandfather escaped the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. His real name was this, which is Iwavinsk Aukas, but nobody in Spain could say that, so they just called him Juan de Fuca. So in 1587-ish, a little bit before that actually, he's sailing around with the Spanish fleet in a ship kind of like this, and he is sailing around the Philippines and the Pacific, and at some point he gets attacked by pirates, English pirates. They steal his ship and they deposit him, they maroon him on Cabo San Lucas. Do you guys remember when we could vacation and go places that were fun? Anyway, he decides he's going to leave Cabo San Lucas and he is going to sail north and he's going to discover the Northwest Passage. He sails up, he's looking for it. His men are like, no, this sucks. I hate this. We're turning around. They threaten to kill him unless he turns the boat around. So he sails back to Cabo San Lucas. Tries it another time. This time he finds something. He finds the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is a little bit of an inlet that's just off the coast of where Tacoma and Seattle are. It's awesome. It's really pretty. There's trees. There's like orcas flopping around and stuff, doing whatever they do. And it kind of goes like this. This is not the Northwest Passage, but it's like a little inlet, and he was super excited about it. And he came back and told everybody he'd found, this might be it. This might be the beginning of the Northwest Passage. It's not, of course, but when he came back, it was a party. He had a party in Acapulco for real. He told everybody that like he was like friends with the King of Spain and that he bought him a beer, whatever. And probably none of that's true, right? We don't have any records of him going and talking to the King of Spain, but he was like, oh no, King of Spain, we're friends now. Like he said I could be like a captain in the Spanish Navy. And he just chills. He goes back to Greece. He just lives like this great life thinking he's found this thing. We don't know if he ever actually found it. We know he definitely didn't talk to the King of Spain. But around 200 years later, there is an English sailor. His name is Charles William Barclay, and he sails to the general area where Juan de Fuca was looking, and he finds the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And Charles Barclay's like, yep, that sounds great, man. You got it. I'm going to name this place after you. So it becomes the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And nowadays, we know it as this little inlet outside of Seattle. And we also know it as the tectonic plate that's going to subduct underneath the Pacific plate and kill us all. Okay, next explorer of this region is a guy named George Vancouver. And he's sailing around in mid-1790s. And he got his start in the Royal Navy at a very young age, and he ended up joining James Cook on James Cook's third expedition. Cook was a very famous English sailor who mapped basically everything along the Pacific Ocean. He went off to discovered all these really cool places, and he brought naturalists with him and artists, and they did really cool art of like things they'd never seen before. Like they drew this, which is supposed to be a kangaroo, and they're like, oh, look, this thing's crazy, man. You'll never believe what they have in Australia. They also drew this, which I swear to you is in a museum in London right now. He also brought like a talented artist with him, but I just cannot get over this lobster. I had to include this piece of art. Okay, this is his third journey, which I know he looks drunk here, but he's actually just following the winds and like trying to like do different areas and stuff like he hasn't done before. And George Vancouver is captaining one of the smaller ships that's along with him. And they go to Tahiti, which had just been discovered, but they go there again to check it out. They discovered Tonga. They go to some new parts of New Zealand they haven't seen before. They actually go all the way up to the Bering Strait and he becomes the first Englishman to get up there. And then they discover Hawaii. And Captain Cook starts messing with the Hawaiians. The Hawaiians get mad. They steal one of his boats. He tries to kidnap the king of Hawaii, and the Hawaiian people get really mad, and they stab him to death, and they may or may not have eaten him. There's everything about this time period and this thing is a little bit problematic, so it's a little bit difficult to pin down whether or not he was actually eaten by the Hawaiians. Anyway, George Vancouver takes over the reins of being the explorer in the Pacific for Great Britain. And he's like, well, Tahiti was nice. I enjoyed being there, but what I really want to explore is the brilliant, beautiful waterways of the Pacific Northwest. So he decides he's going to basically turn this map, which is just, who knows, parts unknown, he's going to turn this into something that's a little bit more recognizable. And he set sail in the HMS Discovery, which was the same ship that he was commanding during Cook's expedition. And he discovers some pretty cool stuff in our area, right? He's got mountains, lakes, some waterways, some islands and stuff. And I don't know if you've ever wondered where a lot of the stuff in our area gets its name from. Like where's Mount Rainier come from, right? Where did that come from? Here's the crew list of the HMS Discovery. It's basically, he just discovered a bunch of stuff. He named an island, a couple cities, a couple settlements after himself, Vancouver. And then he basically just named places he found after guys, whoever he looked at when he turned around. And then when he ran out of guys on his ship, he just started naming them after his friends. Peter Rainier and James Vashon were admirals that he worked with, and Lord St. Helens was a friend of his. I know that this is like probably not cool or it's low-hanging fruit or something, but Peter Rainier was the Minister of Parliament for Sandwich. I know it's probably not cool to bring that up, but I can't not do it. These guys, by the way, were all very famous for beating up the Americans in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812. One guy who was not that cool that was on the ship was Thomas Pitt, the second Baron of Camelford, who nobody has ever had anything nice to say about this guy, except that he was the cousin of the Prime Minister of England at the time. Basically, Camelford is hanging out on the ship. He's on Discovery with Vancouver, and he's causing all kinds of problems, right? He's trying to rip off the natives. He's like going AWOL for days. Vancouver has him flogged. Vancouver has him disciplined a couple times, like pretty severely, like Royal Navy severely in the 18th century. Pitt doesn't like it. And when they get back, he tries to get his cousin to enact some kind of like justice on Vancouver for being a tyrant captain. When that doesn't work, Thomas Pitt attacks Vancouver in the street with a cane and tries to kick his ass. He didn't count on, however, the fact that Vancouver was there with his brother, who took the cane away from the guy and beat him up with it, because that's what bros do. And now we know him primarily as the guy who has Vancouver named after him and the guy who discovered Mount Rainier. The city of Vancouver has a gold statue of him on top of their Capitol building, but it's Canada, so who cares? Okay. Moving forward, Louisiana Purchase happens in 1803, and that's basically when Napoleon was like killing a bunch of English people, but then he ran out of money, and he was like, hey, I need more money so I can kill English people. And we were like, yeah, here, just give us like 14 states. And he was like, fine. So we got 14 states for like, I don't know, $75 or something. And so then we sent these guys, Lewis and Clark, to go explore it. This is the route that they took. You can see in the middle of the purple here, the death of Sergeant Floyd. Sergeant Floyd is the only member of the Lewis and Clark expedition that died along the trip. And these guys didn't just go one way, right? This is a hell of a journey if you're looking at this. They had to go all the way down and back, right? And they had, a little bit, around 100 guys with them. And they all make it back, and they make it back because of this person. Her name is Sacagawea, and you can see her carrying the baby here. She's almost always depicted as like lugging some small child around on her back, which is basically what she did. But they picked her up in Idaho, and she went with them through Washington and Oregon to the coast, and then back, and then went back with her people. So she was a Shoshone Indian, and here's a good example of what Sacagawea brought to the table. Here is here's a boat full of real serious looking guys who are heavily armed and they don't look happy. And here's Sacagawea being like, no, it's cool. Don't worry about it. Like we're fine. These guys are so bad. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of negotiating, and she could speak the languages of the native peoples that they encountered along the way. She could negotiate. She could kind of do some trails. She jumped into the lake a couple times to save people from drowning because some of the guys on the expedition couldn't swim, which seems like a bad profession for a person who can't swim. But they go down the Columbia River and they sail all the way down to the end. You got Oregon on the south here and Washington on the north. They sail all the way down and they end in Seaside, Oregon, a place that is now mostly well known for having a big beach volleyball tournament. Again, this is just making me depressed that I can't go outside. Sacagawea, by the way, is very excellently depicted very, very often as always indicating to Lewis and Clark which direction is west. It's that way, just go there, just pointing at it. She's also the only woman that appears on American money. She's not the first woman. She replaced the first woman, but she is the only woman for now. Okay, in 1812, the British burned down the White House. The treaty that came after the War of 1812 opened up the area where we live for settlement, right? You can kind of see Rupert's Land. I don't know who Rupert is or what the deal is, why they were calling Canada Rupert's Land at this point. But you can see that like the 49th parallel is here, and the area above it is Washington, basically, and the area below it is basically Oregon. But the area was opened up for settlement, and people started moving out here via the Oregon Trail, which was real brutal. Like you left from St. Louis and you just went overland and it was this, right? It was a lot of, look at these guys, they're not having a fun time, right? Just push, stuff's falling out the back. They're pushing the cart here like it's mud, like this lady's mad, all right? Everybody's just in kind of a bad mood. And it was real dangerous, right? There was a lot of bad stuff that could happen along the way. Various outlaw attacks and diseases and all other kinds of problems. But if you made it out here, it it wasn't so bad, right? You could just kind of chill with your friends out in the forest. Everybody was happy. I mean, look at how much fun these guys are having on this trip. They're loving it. They're just loving life. That's the Oregon Trail. Look at Tacoma, man. I mean, it's a great place to visit in 1860. Just wonderful stuff happening here. You can totally see why people would have uprooted their entire lives and traveled, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of miles, probably thousands of miles over land in extreme conditions to come make a new life for themselves here. The big exports from this part of town, or this part of the country, was lumber and fur and fish. So that was kind of, if you moved out here, that was more or less what you did. I want to mention these two guys for a moment. They're two of the earliest settlers out west, immediately after the Oregon Trail opened up. You have George Washington Bush and George Washington. They settled in Washington, in small towns in Washington that you've heard of before, but probably couldn't locate on a map. You should not confuse these two people, however. But they are among the first, they are the first African-American settlers out west. They were both escaped slaves who made their way out here to start a new life. They ended up moving up in Washington. Most people were living down in Oregon because the waterways were a little bit better down there for transporting. And but they moved up to Washington because Oregon is racist and doesn't like to have Black people live there. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Civil War. It's 1861, and here's what the map looks like. Okay, green is the Confederacy, light pink is the Union, fuchsia here, or whatever this color is, are states that wanted to join the Confederacy, but the Union occupied them before they could. And then orange is the states that nobody cares about and that don't even appear on most maps when involving the Civil War. Okay, one thing that that isn't really indicated on this map is that Canada is up here, and Canada is English at this time. And this ends up causing some interesting things for us around the time period of the Civil War. One interesting story is that of Charles Mitchell. In 1860, he was living in Olympia. He was a slave, probably, to a guy that lived in Olympia. He had moved there from South Carolina, I want to say, maybe Maryland, and was living there. And there were ships that were coming in and out of the port. And Charles found out that there was a ship that was coming into port in Olympia, and it was going to put up in Tacoma and then go up to Victoria, Canada. And Canada was English, and they had abolished slavery 100 years ago. So they, the moment, if you were an escaped slave, the moment you set foot on Canadian soil, you were free, because there was no, it was instant, right? You were like a Canadian citizen at that point, and they were going to take you. So he sneaks onto this boat, and he wants to try to make it up to Victoria. But he gets caught by the guys that run the ship, and they throw him in the brig. And they're like, all right, we'll just keep going on our thing. We'll keep finishing our mission. And then when we come back to Olympia, we'll drop you off. But when they put in port in Tacoma, somebody gets news that this kid is on this ship, and they send news to Victoria about what's happening. And when the ship lands, there are like on the dock a very angry horde of Canadians who are like, you're giving us this kid. If we have to storm the boat, we're getting him. And they gave him up. And that is basically the only kind of real slavery dispute that happened up in the Pacific Northwest during this time. But it's a really cool story. And this kid ended up becoming a Canadian citizen. And there was a whole neighborhood of escaped slaves in Vancouver where he lived out through the Civil War. They call it I read one description of it that said it was the Puget Sound Underground Railroad, which only had a party of one. Okay. Speaking of conflicts with the UK, let's talk about the Pig War of 1859, which might be like one of the greatest wars that ever happened. It's on San Juan Island, which is one of those little islands out on the Strait of Juan de Fuca that I was showing you the pictures of. And basically what happened was there was a pig, and he lived, the island is like half English and half US. And this pig lived on the English side. Some Irish guy had a pig. The pig escapes, runs over to the American side and starts eating this farmer's potatoes. He shoots the pig, turns it into bacon. The guy who owned the pig gets mad and goes to the cops and is like, you got to arrest this guy. He shot my pig. He owes me money, or you should put him in jail or whatever. So they send the British Army over there to arrest this guy. And this guy's like, go to hell. I'm a US citizen. I'm not going to go to Canadian jail. America sends the army out to defend this guy because this is a Canadian authority figure coming to take a American citizen away. And so the UK responds by sending their army. And now we have this showdown, this very ridiculous, silly showdown of two like decent sized armies. Like they sent like a battalion of soldiers and like a squadron of British ships out there. And so you've got this really weird standoff going on here. And in the middle of it is the commander of American forces for the Pig War. His name is George Pickett. And he told the British that he was going to give them another Bunker Hill if they had tried to take this guy away. And Bunker Hill, of course, was a battle of the American Revolution where we shot a bunch of British people. The British people were like, yeah, well, if you don't stand down in like 400 years, 300 years, we're not going to let you read any of the Harry Potter books. Everybody eventually decided, whatever, it's cool. Let's just like US, UK, we'll be friends. Like we'll chill. Everybody will be happy. Like, don't worry about it. And the Pig War was ended without anybody firing a gunshot. Luckily, it would be very dumb if people were being shot over this pig. But Pickett ends up going on to be very famous in the Civil War for commanding the battle that lost the Civil War for the South. I mean, that's probably a little harsh on Pickett, but basically it was the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was the farthest north that the South had ever gotten, and they were going to make one big attack to try to break around Union lines, and encircle Washington, D.C. And basically, in some ways, and depending on who you talk, because people love to debate the Civil War, but this was a battle that could have won or lost the war. And Pickett led the division that made the charge, and they call it Pickett's Charge, and the South was defeated utterly in this battle. And it was pretty bad. Somebody later asked him at a party, they were like, what happened with that charge, man? Like you had a chance to win, but then you didn't. And he was like, well, yeah, I always thought the Yankees had something to do with it. Okay, so now we're talking a little bit, kind of getting into the Civil War book. There's not a lot of Civil War history out here. One thing that's interesting, that's worth noting about the Civil War in Washington is that we were really close to the UK. And up until Pickett's Charge, there was always a chance that England would get involved on the side of the Confederacy. Right, because England and the U.S. were having a difficult time. Right, they fought two wars. Right, the Revolution and the War of 1812. They're not on speaking terms really, and we had given Napoleon all that money to help like shoot English people, which they hadn't forgotten about. And so there was a chance that they were trying to work out a deal where England would come in and join the South. And if that happened, there was a chance that you were going to have troops heading south from Vancouver into Washington to try to take some possessions in the West Coast. Very loose chance, but like you had to defend, you had to defend like Oregon. So they built Fort Vancouver, which is a very impressive fort. And it was defended by the brave men of the 1st Washington Volunteer Infantry U.S. Army. It's 1,500 guys. They were stationed at Fort Walla Walla and Fort Vancouver to defend against the Canadians. And during the course of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, they were engaged in 0 battles. They had 0 men die of battle, 12 die of disease, 5 die in accidents, and 5 die of other non-battle causes, which I assume is boredom. One guy who was involved in the Civil War pretty extensively was the first governor of Washington. His name was Isaac Stevens, and he was the governor from 1853 to 1857. Stevens was, he's got a little bit of a Brad Pitt thing going on here. And what he was really into as governor is that he wanted to survey the land in the area. He really wanted to kind of get accurate maps of Washington, right? He knew that there was land here. He knew that it was up for the taking, but he didn't quite know what he had. We had the coast more or less mapped out thanks to George Vancouver, but he wanted to kind of know what else was going on in there. So he's sending teams of Army engineers and other groups of guys out there into the wilderness to try to figure out what's going on. A couple problems arise from that. First is there are already people that live there and they don't want armed soldiers coming around to survey their land. Second is not everybody that's going over there wants to go over there and survey the land either. And so he had to declare martial law on Washington state. And that was kind of something that is a little bit problematic for him. And even his own guys were mad at him. One of the top surveyors for Isaac Stevens was a guy named George Mcclellan. And if George Pickett wasn't the biggest failure of the Civil War, then George Mcclellan was. He's very famous for being in command of the Union Army from the first battle of the war up until he was fired for losing every single battle he ever fought, including the Battle of Antietam, a battle where Union spies found the Confederate plan of battle and literally handed him the Confederate plan. And he thought it was fake news and ignored it and basically acted as though that was the feint and that everything else was the other attack. So he did not win the Battle of Antietam, even though he had the enemy battle plans in his hands. He later went on to run for the presidency in 1864 against Abraham Lincoln on a platform of, hey, let's just, who cares, forget it. Let's just let the South have their own thing. This is a pretty savage political cartoon of the time that I really enjoy. And it kind of gives you an example of like what his chances were of winning under that platform of like, I was a general and I got my butt kicked and now I just want to surrender. So yeah, here's the chart for that. He's blue. It didn't work out very well for him. Kentucky sided with him because Kentucky was one of those states that was under Union occupation that really had wanted to be in the South from the beginning. Interestingly though, under the command of George McClellan early in the war is the 79th New York Highlanders Regiment. And the commander of that is Governor Isaac Stevens, the guy that had fired George McClellan for being incompetent at surveying. And so McClellan responded by sending Governor Isaac Stevens to his death in a hopeless battle. In the Battle of Chantilly in September 1862, Stevens heroically leads a Union attack against a very well-defended Confederate position. This isn't like, he doesn't look particularly heroic or like daring here. He's like sitting on a guy, he's making a weird face, but this is the only piece of art just depicting the death of Governor Isaac Stevens. But his actions were so heroic that he did receive the Medal of Honor, and there weren't like a ton of those given out during the Civil War. So he was leading at the head of his men. Nowadays, the main drag at the University of Washington is named after him. Lake Stevens is named after him. There's a bunch of cool stuff. Basically, everything Stevens is named after either him or his son. His name was Hazard Stevens, and he was a major in the Army, so he is Major Hazard Stevens. And if that guy doesn't look Major Hazard Stevens-y enough for you, then here's what he looked like at the end of his life. And I think that's probably a little better. Hazard Stevens was also with the 79th New York at the Battle of Chantilly. He was there when his father heroically led that charge that led to his death. And yes, this is what the 79th New York Volunteer Infantry wore in the early days of the war. Later on, they went to a more traditional uniform, but in the early days, it was a lot of kilts and plaid, which meant they probably fit in pretty well in Seattle. And so he actually survives Chantilly, survives and takes over command of the 79th New York, and he leads them in the Battle of Fort Huger in April of 1863. And now I don't know if it's Huger or Hugger. The fort was kind of huge, so I'm going to say Huger. Either way, I think I can make a joke out of it. But he heroically leads a charge across this bridge here, and his actions there earn him the Medal of Honor. So it's a father-son Medal of Honor, and they receive them within a calendar year of each other, which is, I don't have any metrics on this, but it seems like it probably hasn't been done very much. His enemy was George Pickett. Okay. After the war, Hazard Stevens returns home, and he's living in Olympia for a little bit, and then Tacoma. He's taking care of his mom, who's now a widow, and he's looking at Mount Rainier, and he's like, I'm going to go up Mount Rainier. I'm going to climb it. So it's never been done before. So he decides he's going to be the first person to summit Mount Rainier. And he decides he's going to go up, not here, he's going to go up when mountain climbing looks like this, right? Just like what is this, right? Just, are you kidding me? You're going to navigate a crevasse in like dress shoes and a hat, right? Like, I don't know what's happening here. They're wearing like a suit to go mountain climbing. It's not good, but he did it, and he gets all the way up to the top. And then he goes back up again, and he brings this woman with him. Her name is Faye Fuller. She is a school teacher. And in 1890, so Hazard Stevens and another guy become the first two to get up to the top of Mount Rainier. And then they go up again with Faye Fuller. And she went up to the top of Mount Rainier, becomes the first woman to summit Mount Rainier. And when she gets up there, she leaves a couple of her hairpins behind so that anybody who climbs after her can see that a woman's been up there first. And she goes on to become a journalist. She was a school teacher, and then afterwards she becomes a journalist. She moves to the Tacoma area and starts writing like a mountaineering basically journal column for the newspaper there, and writing other stories as well. She founds the Washington Alpine Club and also the Tacoma Alpine Club, which still exists today. I'm sure there's a Facebook page somewhere where you can join them. And when you're getting into the turn of the century, it ends up becoming kind of an interesting thing, right? Because Washington State was very forward when it came to two things. One was women's suffrage, which is cool. The other is prohibition, which is not cool. But they were very ahead of the game on both of these. When they were admitted to the Union, Washington State wanted to include both of these items on the list. They weren't allowed to include either, but women were allowed to vote here a little bit before they were in the rest of the country. And we got Prohibition here 2 years before everybody else did also. Emma Smith DeVoe was a very famous suffragette. She created the League of Women Voters. She lived in Tacoma. And then we have Bertha Knight Lands. In 1926, she became the first woman mayor of any city in the United States when she became the mayor of Seattle. But my favorite suffragette from this time period is Helga Espy. She's from Spokane in 1896. Helga was an immigrant from Norway, and she was living in this farm. Her husband like broke his back or had some kind of gnarly accident where he couldn't work, and the farm was not doing well. They were like $10,000. They were like, I don't know, $10,000 in the hole or something. And there came up this contest where somebody was saying if a woman can walk from coast to coast, right, basically like from Washington to New York City, that they will give this person $20,000 or $10,000 or whatever. And so she decides she's going to do this. And she leaves with her 17-year-old daughter, Clara. And they are going to walk from Spokane to New York, which is looks like a 842-hour walk. I had to add Chicago in there because otherwise it wants you to take a ferry over Lake Michigan, which I don't think was a possibility at the time, or like might not have been part of the deal. Looks like some pretty gnarly elevation gain there as well. And now you're going through like Montana and South Dakota. You're going through some pretty like desolate areas. It's a lot of walking through this, but a lot of walking through this in 1896, which is like the year Red Dead Redemption is set. So a lot of outlaw stuff going on, a lot of Apache, a lot of, just, it's really not an awesome time to be two women unaccompanied wandering through the countryside. But they showed up and they came armed, right? They got 2 guns, they got a knife, they've got homemade pepper spray, which I didn't know was a thing in 1896, but it looks pretty hardcore. And they've got, this is actually Clara's curling irons, which are not weapons, but they look like medieval torture devices. So I felt I'd include them as well. They do this walk and it takes them a long time. Clara sprains her ankle along the way. They're kind of clever about how they do it because they know that the railroad goes from coast to coast. So they follow the railroad, which is smart. And they're able to kind of, when they get to places, they're able to ask the people that live there if they could stay, and they were able to find shelter a lot of nights. They didn't have to do a ton of camping, as much as you would think at least. But they get to New York. They're delayed a couple days because Clara sprained her ankle, and the guys do not pay the money that they said they were going to. And not only that, but they don't even know how they're going to get home. So the story had gotten picked up by a couple papers, and some railroad guy was like, yeah, you know what, I'll give you a ticket so you can go and you can go back home. Go back home. She finds out 2 of her kids have died while she was gone, and her husband's mad at her, and the whole Norwegian community is mad at her because she's doing like some darned fool thing and like trying to be all independent or whatever. But it ends up working out well for her in the long run. Her husband ends up like being like, well, I can't let my wife be the celebrity in the family or do all the work or whatever. So he gets a job in a construction business, ends up making a bunch of money. She becomes a very powerful spokesman for the women's suffrage movement because she's like, look what I can do, right? Like, why can't I vote, right? I can do this walk. And she writes her autobiography. She does a lot of speaking stuff. She ends up becoming kind of a celebrity in the Spokane area. This isn't the book she wrote. This is the book. This book is from a few years ago, and it was written by her great granddaughter. But yeah, her book was also famous as well. So a lot changes in Seattle between 1860 and 1900. Only 40 years, but it's a pretty significant change. A lot of that is due to the Yukon gold that everybody wanted, because these guys are like having so much fun out here, just like mining for gold. They just look like the happiest group of dudes out here having a good time. And then between 1900 and 1940, there's another big boom, right? All this industry starts showing up here. And, you know, speaking of which, like, I don't feel like the city looks right without that. I think we need that. I would probably need that. And then like, probably like all that. I broke it. Okay. All right. Now we're getting into World War II. All right. World War II is, when a lot of people think of Washington State in World War II, they think of, think of Boeing. right? You've got all of these B-17s are being churned out by Boeing, and you've got the B-25s. You've got, you've got a lot of the B-29s. You've got all these like great bombers that are being churned out by Boeing, and there's a lot of like really heroic stories of bomber pilots who are flying over enemy territory, and these things are getting shot to Swiss cheese, but these guys are gliding home on them. These things were called flying fortresses, and they were for real. They had 6 machine guns on them, and they could carry tens of thousands of pounds of bombs. And these guys were very instrumental in destroying the Nazi war machine during the war. But that's not what I'm going to talk about for my World War II section here. I want to talk about a guy named Pappy Boyington. He was from Tacoma, and I love this quote where he says, "If this story were to have a moral, then I would just say, just name a hero, and I'll prove he's a bum." I think that's great. I think it works the other way too. I think you can say that there's a lot of average people who can do heroic things, but I do like this kind of, all these people are just guys, right? All these people are just people. There's nothing special about them when they're born. They just do amazing things, and that's kind of what I like to talk about when I do these book talks. So Pappy Boyington was growing up in Tacoma, and he goes to an air show one day, and he sees this guy. His name is Clyde Pangborn, and he was one of these barnstormers. So like, they had only just they'd had human flight for like 10 years at this point, right? But all these guys are doing all these crazy things with airplanes. That is a man flying a biplane, and he drops the ladder, and he's climbing down the ladder and dropping into a moving car from the airplane, right? Like, so, and there's a lot of people who have shown up to see this. I think he missed here though. I think he actually broke both his legs doing this stunt, but that's just the life of a barnstormer. It was like X Games 1920 kind of thing, right? And so Pappy Boyington goes to one of these events, and he's just like, man, this looks awesome. I want to learn how to fly. This is incredible. I think he goes up with Pangborn in the back seat of the plane at one point, and he's just like, he's obsessed. He loves it. So when he gets he goes to the University of Washington. When he gets out, he goes immediately into the Marine Corps, and he wants to be an aviator. So he gets behind the wheel of or he gets behind the stick of there's a big problem with this when he wants to be behind the stick of aircraft. He gets into fights a lot. He gets into a lot of fights, usually with his commanding officer, but not exclusively with his commanding officer. So he gets busted up, and he gets busted down, and he gets into fights, and then he'll get promoted, and then he'll punch his commander in the face, and he'll get demoted. But they ended up they had to respect this guy because he was a good leader. He didn't beat up the guys he didn't beat up his subordinates. He just beat up his commanders. And he was a very talented flyer, right? He was unbelievable, right? And he had 20 years of experience flying by the time World War I had started, right? And so he joins the American Volunteer Group. They're called the Flying Tigers, and they head over to, it was a volunteer group of pilots who head over to China to fight against the Japanese. And this is before the United States is officially kind of involved with things. So these guys were flying for the Air Force of the Republic of China. And but they were all Americans. They were flying P-40s, which is American airplane. And Pappy Boyington is a pretty high-ranking officer in the Flying Tigers. He shoots down 6 Japanese aircraft during the fighting over here. And this is some pretty dangerous stuff, because getting shot down over China is very dangerous because you don't know who's going to pick you up, right? A lot of China was occupied by the Japanese at the time. So there was a lot of chance that if you got shot down, that was going to be the end of the war for you. And it was a lot of having bases out in really remote parts of various Chinese cities or countrysides, trying to hide from enemy attacks, and then scrambling when you could to get up and try to shoot down some Zeros and stuff. He got into trouble when there was a big parade, and Chiang Kai-shek, who was the president of China, was in attendance with his wife, and Pappy Boyington buzzed the tower with his commanding officer sitting next to the president of China and the first lady of China, and he knocked all 3 of them out of their chairs. So that's just this guy, right? That's Pappy Boyington. They eventually, of course, give him command of a squadron. He gets into a pretty bad plane crash towards the end of his service with the Flying Tigers, and breaks both his legs. And they think maybe he's not going to walk again, let alone fly. But he does this really intense rehab, and he gets back to where he can fly again. And he's like, I'm ready to go. So the Army's like, all right, just we're like, the Army at this point is, or the Marines at this point are committed, right? The Marines are going to, they've got everybody kind of in the field, and they're just trying to assemble squadrons and throw them out, because the early days of World War II in the Pacific, it was like kind of hit or miss, right, before Midway. And so they're like, well, just take whatever guys you can find and just put them into a squadron and just do something with them. And so that's what he did. They were all black sheep, so he calls it the Black Sheep Squadron. It ended up being all the guys that like got left out of other places, and they end up becoming the most famous Marine fighter squadron of World War II. The Black Sheeps are flying these Corsairs, they're fighting Zeros, and Pappy Boyington is just mowing them down. He's blasting Zeros out of the sky. He's shooting down all kinds of Japanese aircraft. He shoots down, at one point he gets what's called ace in a day, which is when you shoot down 5 enemy aircraft in a single mission. Very, very rare thing. If you're called a fighter ace if you get 5 kills lifetime, and if you get them in a day, it's like incredibly rare. But that's just the kind of guy he was. He was very effective. He ends up shooting down 22 Japanese aircraft over the course of his flying with the Black Sheep Squadron. And if you had counted, so the most that had ever at any point been shot down by an American fighter pilot was a guy named Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I. He shot down 26 airplanes. And Pappy Boyington shot down 22 when he was with the Black Sheep, but he also shot down 6 when he was with the Flying Tigers. Because he wasn't in the United States military, those ones don't count towards the score. As far as it's just record keeping and numbers at those points, but he didn't like that. He didn't get the recognition that he was like the highest scoring fighter ace in American history. Pappy Boyington eventually gets shot down by the Japanese over the Pacific Ocean. He is leading his squadron against a much larger formation. They take out a lot of the Zeros, but he's going to cover the rest of his guys as they break off. And the last time he's seen, he's kind of diving and weaving in among, dozens of Japanese fighters shooting at him from all sides. And he is shot down and he crashes in the ocean. He is posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the highest award that the United States offers for any kind of military bravery. Except he's not dead. He lives. He gets picked up by what's called a Japanese hell ship, which is a prison ship. This ship kind of looks like fun. I know it was really, really miserable, but this ship doesn't look so bad. So I'm going to replace it with this heavy metal album cover. But yeah, it was just this basically horrible Japanese torture ship for 5 years, or not 5 years, for 5 months. And then the war ends and he comes home, and they had this big parade for him in Seattle. And he personally accepts the Medal of Honor that had been awarded to him posthumously, which is a very rare thing and has only been done a couple times in history. So I think that's a really cool story. They made a TV show out of his life. It's called Baba Black Sheep, and he actually made a couple of cameo appearances in the show. It was this war show that was on TV in the 50s or 60s or something. It was actually the television debut of John Larroquette. And John Larroquette, of course, was in JFK with Kevin Bacon. There's another Medal of Honor guy that I want to talk about from World War II. His name was Douglas Monroe. He's got a little bit of a Ryan Gosling thing going on here. He was from Cle-Elum. He was a signalman first class in the Coast Guard. And he was in Guadalcanal. Right, and so you got these boats. You've seen these on D-Day, but we had them to bring Marines onto the beach of Guadalcanal as well. And these 2 guys sitting in the front are manning machine guns, and the photo is basically being taken from the point where the pilot would be. Or actually, never mind. This guy's the pilot. I'm thinking of the other ones. Okay, so these 3 guys in the front, they're Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was landing these ships for the Marine Corps. And this is some real dangerous stuff that you're rolling up on here. And the Marines land at Guadalcanal, and they land at this battle. They are in it immediately, right? This vehicle right here is a Japanese tank. That's how close they were to the shore to try to repel this attack. And it is very intense firefight. And then what ends up happening is Monroe is this guy here, and he ends up, the Marines get pushed back, and they got to get back off the beach because there's too many guys in the forest. It's not going to happen. So as the landing craft are coming up to bring Marines off, as they're loading them off, Monroe is in an unloaded boat here, and he pulls up. It's called a Higgins boat. He pulls up in front of the other Higgins boats to screen them, to shoot his machine gun and try to lay down covering fire and basically screen so the rest of the Marines can get off the beach. He is killed in action, and he also receives the Medal of Honor. And because it's very rare, because the Medal of Honor is only awarded for military engagements, and the Coast Guard are in so few military engagements, they were at Guadalcanal, and this is the only Coast Guard Medal of Honor that has ever been awarded. It was given to Douglas Monroe from Mcclellan. Okay. Another interesting World War II fact is that the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki and the plane that dropped it were both created in Washington. The B-29 Enola Gay was created at the Boeing factory, and the Fat Man was created at the Hanford site, which is where we did a bunch of plutonium refining. It is, to this day, the most irradiated place in the United States. Okay. I want to just do like a little bit of a lightning round here. I know I'm running out of time. And so I just want to kind of get to a couple of other characters that people that I wanted to talk about that aren't quite like, I got 5 minutes to talk here. So, okay. First one, Bruce Lee went to the University of Washington. I mean, he not only is one of the greatest action movie heroes of all time, if not the greatest personal hero of mine. He trained Steve McQueen in hand-to-hand fighting. He was actual like world karate champion or martial kung fu champion. He was from here, and I think that he is one of the greatest martial artists who has ever lived. He was a guy who could really do the stuff that you see in the movies. In fact, even better than that, because the frames per second of those old cameras were too slow to pick up his movement. So he said that he had to do his actions like at 80% speed, 70% speed in order for the camera to pick it up. Of course, Washington State's also known for amazing musicians. I could have gone any grunge stuff here. I could have gone, I love Duff McKagan and I love Kenny Loggins, but we've got to go Jimi Hendrix on badass musicians from the area. He had to go to England to become famous, but just completely groundbreaking, completely innovative. Another personal hero of mine that I wanted to include here. The lunar rover was built in Kent, Washington. There's 3 of them still on the moon currently. And I don't know if this got passed, but when I was talking to the guys that built the lunar rover, they were saying that there's a petition in the works to make them like national landmarks on the moon. Would be the only, like, there's only like 2 national landmarks that are not on Earth, and this would be one of them. I'm including Bonnie Dunbar. She was an astronaut who went on five shuttle missions, and she now like leads an engineering school in Texas. And then I also wanted to say that, like, there's all these epic stories of heroism that I'm talking about, but there's also a lot of the stuff that comes up here is just regular people, right? Like, so Gracie Helinski was an off-duty National Guard officer who she was a medic, and she saw like last year she was at like a gas station, and she saw some kid in one of the cars nearby was having a seizure, and basically he was clinically dead, like stopped breathing, no pulse. So she got into the car, pulled the little girl out and brought her back to life, basically. And then I'm including Spencer Uber and Terrence Billy. They, in like January, were driving on the highway, and they saw some dude had like crashed his Camaro into the side rail. It had burst into flames and was actively on fire. And both of these guys stopped in their cars to pull this guy out of the burning car. And they got him out just before the car like completely exploded. They were injured, but these Spencer Uber is like, he's a cook at like a restaurant, right? These are just regular people that are able to get out and do some pretty amazing things. Okay, I think that's all I got. I'm at an hour now, so I should let you guys go, but I wanted to say thanks. And if you have questions or comments or any of those kind of things, I will be happy to answer them. Okay, thanks. It's very weird doing this without like people clapping when I do my end bit. I'm gonna stop sharing my thing now though. I have no idea. I'm just talking to myself. I could feel myself rambling.
No, it was great. And also I feel like that should get people credit for like some sort of history course, like this great overview, like an overlook of all of these things. I love it.
I was making the presentation and I was like at 110 slides or something, and I was like, oh no, I don't know, this is gonna be a 4-hour talk.
Oh, it was a really fun overview, and I could see people getting really excited as you brought up kind of their favorite moments from Washington state history. There's a lot of love talking about that pig and the pig war, bacon, all of those things. So let's start off with the first question that we got during the program, which is from Gus, who I know is a big fan of yours. But he was curious what inspired you to write your first book.
Oh, yeah. So this is like a weird thing. That's one thing to talk about because like, I didn't expect to be a historian or an author or any of those things, right? Like I'm just a guy, right? I went to college. I like history. I studied history. I always thought that stuff was cool. But when I got out, I just got a day job, right? There's not a lot of professional history jobs, and I got a job working at a university, and I was we didn't have summer classes at my school where I was working. And so over the summer, we still had to have somebody in the office in case somebody came in and they had questions or whatever. But I was working in a building that used to be like a cathedral or something. So it was this very like Gothic, like churchy looking place with stained glass and stuff. And I was on the 3rd floor, and like you'd come out of the elevator and everything would be totally black except like the one light coming out of my door. And you could hear your footsteps echoing as you walk down the hall, and it was this very like creepy setting. But then I would just sit alone at my desk and like wait for somebody to come to have a question about if they wanted to register for classes in 3 months or whatever. So it was a lot of downtime, and I just started writing stories on my blog, just like basically like, hey, I read this cool thing today. Here's like Julius Caesar's story in 4 sentences or whatever. And I started posting it on a website back when like there were websites and people would go to websites to read the content. And it was like, Ben's Cool GeoCities page or whatever, and I would just post these things.
The web. Yeah.
Yeah. It predates Twitter, Facebook, it predates social media, it predates all that stuff. I used to do the website in like HTML using Notepad, just upload Notepad files. Yeah, so I remember like I would just write these things and post them up there, and I'd get 5 hits a week. It would be like me twice and my mom and 2 of my friends. And then I remember the first time I got an email from a person I didn't know, and I was like, oh my God, I printed it out and put it up over my computer because I was like, oh my God, this person I don't even know read my stuff and they like it. That's so cool. And then it kind of went a little bit crazy where I was starting to get 10 hits a week, 20, 50, 100, 1,000. And then it got to the point where I was getting 1 to 2 million hits a month on the website. And that just became like, wow, what is happening here, right? And so then I was able to turn that into a book. And then it's like just kind of gotten out of control since then, which is like just really awesome. I just kind of fell into it as just, this is what I like and this is what I love, and I just want to talk about it with people. And it's really cool to be able to do that more or less professionally now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're having the best time for it. I'm so glad that you wrote all of these books. And
I'm glad. It's so hard because I can't see anybody. I'm just looking at myself in the thing here, and I'm talking into my webcam, and I'm like, is anybody still with me? Anybody out there?
Well, and I think one of the really fun parts, everyone's kind of talking about how they want to legally change their name to some of these names. Like, I think the most popular one now is a combination, Pappy Hazard being a new favorite name, or maybe Firstborn should be Pappy Hazard. Are there any other really fun, delightful names from your research?
Yes, I'm going to share this with you. It's going to take me 2 seconds to pull it up, but I have a slide from my Viking talk that I would like to pull up for you.
I imagine Vikings have some really exceptional names.
They had great ones, right? Because their last names were either like, the name of their. Hang on, give me 1 second here. I'm working on it as fast as I can. I gotta adjust my settings to make it pop up right. Okay. Yeah, the Vikings, like they named their kids. It was like if your dad was Eric, you were Erickson, and or Eric's daughter, depending on if you were a son or a daughter, of course. And but then you would get these cool epithets, right? And I'm gonna share this with you because these are cool. You got it?
Oh yeah.
All right. So these are some of my favorite Viking names. Harold Bluetooth. So the Bluetooth headsets are named after him, and we think it's either because he had a dead tooth, like like when sometimes when you get you get hit in the head or something, like your tooth gets dead and it turns gray. It was either that, or there is evidence. Well, that's what they thought it was for a long time, but then there became evidence that some Vikings that we found had like a line filed across the front teeth, and they believe there was a chance that like they would grind a line in the teeth and then paint them blue to like be extra scary, which would work. Magnus Barelegs was a Viking who raided in Scotland, and he really liked the kilts, so he started wearing them. So they called him Barelegs because he was just a Viking in a kilt. Einar Jingle Scale was
a Viking in a kilt. I don't know what would be.
It's no good, right? People would always give him a hard time about it too, and he'd be like, "Oh, well, it's comfortable." Einar Jingle Scale was a musician. Eyvind the Plagiarist was a writer, and we didn't know. There's two ways to translate the word from the Old Norse. Plagiarist is one, and destroyer of skalds is the other, which could be a good thing or a bad thing. So we don't really know. You generally see it as plagiarist. Olaf Crowbone was really into throwing bones to like divine things. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. Thorbjörg the Ship-Chested was a woman. So a lot of interesting names here. I did Harold Bluetooth with a Bluetooth headset there. I forgot about that joke, but it's making me laugh now, which is a very silly thing. I don't know why I laugh at my own jokes when I reread them. It's very dumb because my favorite jokes that I write are always just like the stupid puns, the stupid things like that. When I go back and reread them,
I don't know. I find them delightful. And right now, when you're talking to yourself, you need to make sure that it amuses you at least.
It's very silly because I write these things, and anytime a book comes out, you have to proofread everything a million times, right? You read it, you proof it a couple times before you send it out, then you do your editor notes, you do the copy editor notes, you do the fact checker notes, and by the time you're done, like you've read this book so much that nothing is funny, nothing means anything, no word makes sense anymore. Like they asked Nabokov about what happened to somebody was talking to him about Lolita, and he was like, whatever happened to the original manuscript for Lolita? And he was like, I burned it for firewood, I was cold. All the hand edited typewritten, but it's like, and you think like, oh my god, you could have sold those for like $1,000 a page. And I get it, man. I use them for check wrappers. Like I just get so tired looking at this stuff. But now I'm far enough removed that when I go back to some of my old stuff, I forgot what I wrote. And so I read it and it's like, this is great. This guy's got the same sense of humor as me, like everything's funny. So it's a toss up, right?
Yeah, the unglamorous parts of being an author and kind of putting those things together, the editing process, dreaded.
Yeah, you have to just let it go. You have to, I can't remember who said it now, but they say that like literature is not completed, it's abandoned. It's abandoned. You just let it go. I'm not going to look at this anymore. I'm done. It's all gibberish.
Forget it. Well, someone was curious what you would pick for your Viking name.
Oh, my Viking name. I don't know. I don't feel like I'd get a very good one. I feel like I'm not badass, right? That's the thing that comes up a lot. They're like, so you think you're badass? You wrote a book called Badass. And I'm like, no, not really. I'll write about them.
Connoisseur, appreciator. Yeah.
Yes, you go stand in front of the bullets and hit people with swords. I'll stay right here and I'll write it. I'll type.
I'll document. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd probably be Ivan the Plagiarist, honestly. If it came down to it, out of all those names, that's the one I would enjoy. Destroyer of Skulls. That'd be pretty sweet. It doesn't really, nothing really works with Ben though. Ben the Destroyer of Skulls. It doesn't really have the same ring to it. I don't know.
Well, so you talked about a few different people that are kind of like controversial figures in Washington state history. So like, for example, Isaac Stevens is really complicated in that like, he goes off to the Civil War and he's fighting for the Union and doing all these great things. But in Washington state, what becomes Washington state, he's kind of pulling some
Indians,
and fighting indigenous peoples that eventually leads to the hanging of Chief Leshai that later is exonerated. But on that vein, who do you think is maybe one of the most misunderstood people in history?
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky, right? It gets really difficult when you talk about some of these stories, right? So I wrote a World War II book and I wrote a Civil War book, right? And there's a lot going on here that is, really requires very delicate handling. And it makes it very difficult to write about because on the one hand, I want to do just like fun, exciting action. Like, yeah, here's this awesome story that happened. And here's this cool thing that this guy did. And everything's just, but then it's like, that doesn't work if I'm talking slavery, Holocaust, like war with the indigenous peoples, right? You can't like crack jokes about that. It's not cool. It's not like respectful. You kind of have to, certain things you have to handle with a little bit more care and respect. And, but then you can't ignore it because that's not cool either, right? You can't not talk about this stuff because that's even worse than just making a dumb joke about it. So it's a difficult thing that comes up because getting into the real ins and outs of even just talking about the cause of the Civil War, right? Like there's so much going on, so many things at play in this that like, it's really beyond the scope of what I'm working on to get involved too much with it because it's like, I don't really want to write a whole chapter that's just going to make everybody sad and bummed out and miserable, right? Because I just want to tell a cool story about this guy that like swung across on a rope from a boat and like hit a guy with a sword, right? Like, but you run into a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of, especially when you're talking back in like Manifest Destiny time period, right? You've got a lot of stuff going on in the US that is in this different time, right? The most forward thinking people in the world, right? In the Western world, you still get like a Thomas Jefferson, right? Like he was trying to he wrote slavery out of the Declaration of Independence and he ended up having to put it back in. And he had slaves, but there was this law in Virginia called the Manumission Act where you couldn't free your slaves. You couldn't do it. You could do it on your death, but you just couldn't like just say like you're free now. And there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on with that because I think he gets kind of a bad rap because he was very progressive compared to the other people that were around at that time period. But it gets difficult, right? And there's a lot of stuff going on, and like I said, it's heavy stuff. There's a lot of depressing stuff in history that's not fun to read about or talk about.
Absolutely. And there's people that we talk about just on like our general fourth grade field trips that kind of like help illustrate these moments in time. For example, Ezra Meeker, who we have to thank for like our big acknowledgement of the Oregon Trail, he ends up like preserving it through like taking those trips again and kind of like raising money for those markers and sharing all those stories. But then you go back and you look at some letters from other people and it sounds like he was kind of a jerk and he like gets all this money in these different adventures and loses it. And he's just like quite the character. So whoever writes the book at the time kind of ends up being the hero in a sense. But when you actually look at these people, they're people, like you say, like they're complex.
Yeah, there's a lot going on to a lot of people. And yeah, dude, never read the biographies of like the authors that you like because they were almost always terrible, almost always bad people. It's like so many authors are like, I like your books. I wish you weren't like this in real life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's it, right? Everybody's complicated, right? And everybody's a product of the time that they live in as well, right? Where it's like, things change, right? The world changes, and what's normal and what's even like, if you go back to some of the old stuff that I wrote in the early days of the website, right? 15 years ago, there were jokes I could crack then that I read them now. And I'm like, if you go back and watch like some movies from the 80s, right? It's just like, oh man, like this is like not cool to crack jokes about this anymore. Like it feels bad now. But at the time, I remember thinking like Eddie Murphy Raw was was the funniest thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. And there's a lot of stuff in there that's like kind of problematic now.
Oh yeah, I just rewatched that recently and I was like, yikes.
Doesn't hold up, right? Like it's tough, right? But it's just tough. Things change and you change too, right? That's another thing that happens with history, right?
Mm-hmm,
Things moving forward.
So you like to highlight all of these badasses, if you will, these people that are doing these incredible things. And it tends to be during times of war. Yes. So why is it that you like to write about war specifically? And that's like from all of James. I want to acknowledge that too.
I don't know. All good drama comes from conflict, right? And that's like the ultimate conflict. I just like an action movie maniac too, right? Like I just love this stuff. I love war movies. I love action stuff. I love all this kinds of, all the pulp novels that you read, all of like the great adventure stories. There's always fighting and mayhem and destruction and all this stuff. I don't actually want to live any of it. I don't want to like have to shoot somebody in real life or have anybody point a gun at me in real life. I'm like not badass in real life. I just think this stuff is really cool. And like, it's also like a very good opportunity to like reveal heroism that people have that wouldn't normally come out, right? And not even necessarily war. If I think I talk about at the end, those two guys that pulled their car over on the highway to like, pull a guy out of it, right? And it's one of those questions that I think a lot of people have where it's like, would I have the guts to do that if I was in that situation? I don't know, you know? And so it's just, it really draws out this heroism in people where it's like, you get these guys who are running at bullets, right? To do this, to for what they believe in, right? And that's a, you know, when we talk about things being problematic or whatever, like it's very difficult to convince somebody to run to their death for a cause that they don't in some way think is like, okay. Very difficult thing to do. Like you don't want to die for nothing, right? You don't want to die for something you don't believe in. And so it's an interesting thing with war and stuff where you're like, okay, well, you know, why did this guy think this or why did he feel this way? I don't know. I'm getting deep now and I'm supposed to be
No, that's funny because like so often we find ourselves saying like, it's not so great living in history, right? As we sit here in a global pandemic, like I'd rather read about this later, but then you end up seeing all of these moments with new heroes and like people that are like going out there and doing these incredible things. So
yeah. I mean, that's a question that I get a lot, which is like, oh, if you could go back to any time period in history, where would you go? I'm like, nowhere. I would never go back in time. You do not want to go back. You want penicillin and ibuprofen, and you want like. You want to not have air raid sirens going off. There's like no other place or time I would want to be.
Well, maybe you should start looking at plagues throughout history and finding the incredible people that did crazy things for what they believe in. I don't know if there's.
I was gonna do a badass article on the plague village of Eam, which is like when they the Black Death was traveling through Great Britain or England, I guess at the time. And there was one town, it was called Eam, and they were like, the plague stops with us. We are going to all get it and we'll quarantine ourselves and we'll all die. And that'll just be this. And that was as far north as the plague went. They sacrificed themselves to save Scotland, I guess. And I started to research it and I was just like, this is too depressing. It sucks. I don't want to read about this. This is too close to home. I want to read about somebody going to Cabo San Lucas.
Yeah, let's focus on that. I know, a little too much of a downer. You highlighted a number of different people from Washington State, specifically that flew planes. And it just made me think of, we have some really incredible female pilots, but we also have a letter in our collections that's from Amelia Earhart, because this person actually like wrote her a fan letter, and I wanted to highlight her really quickly. Her name is Alma Heflin, and she got this letter back from Amelia Earhart in 1936. And Alma actually went on to become the first female commercial pilot in the United States, and actually assisted the World War II war effort as a bush pilot in Alaska. Just amazing. So
yeah, that's really cool.
The historian Linda Dannon was doing a bunch of research, so we're hoping to get some presentations from her about that pilot. Sounds incredible.
That would be really awesome. I'd love to see that. Amelia Earhart was super interesting, right? They never really quite portray her right in movies because she was really like hardcore person, right? Like she was a really interesting person and very like progressive by today's standards. Right. Very, very interesting. And I thought she was, I wrote an article about her many years ago.
So fascinating. Well, Gus had another question related to planes. He was curious, what is your favorite World War II plane?
Ooh, that's such a tough call.
There's so many good ones. I mean,
what's up?
There's so many good ones. How do you even choose?
So good ones, right? Yeah, it's difficult. Gosh, I probably would go, I mean, I think you'd have to go Spitfire, but like off the top of my head, the B-17 is up there. I think realistically, the Zero is very interesting because it was in use the entire time and it was like very advanced early and it was still usable towards the end. And then there's all those crazy planes, right? You have the Me-262, which was the first jet plane. We were talking earlier about the Night Witches, and they were flying the P-02, which was just like wood and canvas and went 60 miles an hour. And the Germans were trying to shoot it down with Messerschmitts. And like, it was the max speed of this biplane was slower than the stall speed of the Messerschmitt. So like if you dropped in behind it and tried to match speed, you would just crash. So God, there's so many cool ones. Makes it very difficult to pick one. Yeah, I guess gun to my head, I'll go Spitfire.
I love that. Well, and so many of these planes that you mentioned specifically, you can actually go visit in person at Museum of Flight up in Seattle. And they have especially a lot of materials related to the Flying Tigers, not just the plane, but also, you know, like different journals and materials that are from that time period, which is amazing to see in person.
I have a Flying Tiger chit hanging up in my house. There was like, actually, I'm just going to grab it.
Filling time, waiting for the Flying Tiger thing. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was like, so if you were shot down as a Flying Tiger, this thing, it says basically like, I'm an American, you know, I'm with the Republic of China. I'm a friend, you know, give me shelter or whatever. And since, you know, the pilots who were flying with the Flying Tigers couldn't speak Mandarin, they would just hand this thing if they got shot down, and they were picked up by Republic of China forces. And yeah, I think that's such an interesting story. So many interesting stories coming from those things. And like, I really wanted to get into it more when I was talking about Pappy Boyington, but like, they were characters, right? These guys were all volunteers. These guys were, there's every, like the super straight laced guys and the guys who were like drinking whiskey and playing piano and then getting into an airplane and flying around to fight Japanese, right? Like, so many cool characters, so many cool stories. And like, I could have done an hour presentation on just him, you know?
Oh, absolutely. They're so fascinating. One of my other favorite planes, this is totally unrelated to Washington State history, but that's up at Museum of Flight, is the Blackbird SR-71. And I just love that because for how long, they pulled it out of retirement, 5 different times because there wasn't anything better. And that was built in right around 1970 or so. So it's totally incredible.
Yeah,
and
it's still the fastest plane ever built. I wrote about it on the website like not that long ago. You had to wear like a spacesuit to fly it. And like it got replaced, it got phased out because of satellites, right? Not because they invented a better plane. And it would travel faster than the speed of a surface-to-air missile. So like you couldn't shoot it down because it was faster than the missile you were shooting at it. You read some of the stories from some of the guys that piloted those things, and they're amazing, right? Unbelievable. Just such an intense thing. Very like brave people who get up and do these to pilot these things, and like. It didn't even have guns. It didn't have missiles. It didn't have any defenses, right? Other than just go fast. Its defenses were still like open throttle.
Yeah. The fact that it would sit at ground level and just leak fuel because it needed to expand enough, like in flight. It's just
They built it so that it would leak fuel because it needed to go up high enough to an altitude that the metal would expand and seal the fuel tank, because otherwise they'd rupture it. I always like the look of the P-38. That's the one with the 2 tails. Like that's such a cool looking aircraft. I would play a lot of 1942 in the arcade when I was growing up, and so I remember that being the plane from that. And I just remember really thinking that was looked like some kind of sci-fi plane or something. And it's cool because in all of this technology is being basically developed as they go, right? They're just figuring this stuff out and just like, oh, maybe this will work, or maybe we'll do this. We'll put the propeller in the back, see if that does anything. And all of these weird things because they're, you know, World War II, like they had learned 50 years before World War II, there was no such thing as powered human flight, right? Like, it's one person's lifetime from like, I've only ever ridden horses to like, I'm flying in a jet fighter.
Absolutely. Amazing. We have less of a question and more of like, can you please do this comment, which is, could you start a blog that highlights everyday heroes? Like the people that you mentioned at the end. It's like, man, we need more of that good news.
Yeah, I would like to. I mean, I try to factor them into the Badass page as well if I can. But it's a book that I've been wanting to write, which is just kind of like everyday heroes kind of thing, where there's all kinds of crazy stories, right? There was a story of a guy in Florida who an airplane crashed into his neighbor's house and he ran in to like pull the family out, right? Like what? There's the guy who like jumped onto the railroad tracks in the New York subway to like pull a guy off who was having a seizure before the train hit him. And there's all these amazing stories of just regular people put into these super intense situations, and they just do these heroic things. And I love, my favorite thing with all of this stuff is like you ask a lot of these people, like they're interviewed about their actions or whatever, and they're just like, especially the military guys, they're always just like, well, I just did what anybody else would do. Like, I'm not the real hero. Like my guys are the heroes. They're the ones who are out there doing this every day. Like, I'm just doing my job. Or you hear people who are just like, I just did what anybody else would have done. Like, no, you didn't, bud. You did not do what everybody else would have done. Nobody else was going to dive on a grenade, right? Like, yeah, it's so interesting. And some of them, they just go into like panic mode or whatever, where there's a guy who, he was a Gurkha, which was a Nepalese soldier who was fighting alongside the English in World War II, the British in World War II. And these Gurkhas are like, they're like the toughest. They're insanely tough. And he went up and he was like fighting the Japanese in Burma, I think. And he like goes in and he's just like wiping out Japanese machine gun bunkers. He's running, they're shooting machine guns at him, they can't hit him. He runs in, he kills people with like rocks and knives and grenades and all this stuff, gets the Victoria Cross. And the Queen asks him, what was he thinking about when it happened? Well, maybe it wasn't the Queen, maybe it was a reporter. He meets the Queen, and then a reporter asks him like, what was going through your head when all this stuff was going down? And he's like, I forget. I don't know. I don't remember. Okay.
A little awestruck meeting the Queen, like, I don't know.
I don't know, man. Like, I've been there, buddy.
Well, let's take it out on maybe who is your favorite person in history that you've kind of researched and written about?
It's tough, right? It's a really tough question because, I mean, even for the first book, I had to cut it down to 40, which is like trying to figure out which fingers you're going to take off, you know, trying to cut like, oh, I don't really need this one as much. Like, I'll just cut Attila the Hun out of the book. So it's really difficult to narrow it down. It was difficult to narrow it down to 40. It's even harder to narrow it down to 1. But I guess like my answer to this is usually like, there's a guy that I like to talk about. He was an Irish hero in the like the early 1100s. His name was Wolf the Quarrelsome, and he was this yeah, Wolf the Quarrelsome. He was this big Irish dude, and he only appears in history twice. Once the Vikings wrote for the same battle. The Vikings wrote a version of it, and the Irish wrote a version of it. And basically, he was like the brother of the King of Ireland, and there was this big battle that was taking place in Ireland. The Vikings had settled Ireland, and the Irish were trying to throw them out. And this war had been going on for a long time, but the Vikings, I think it was 1014 is the year, Battle of Clontarf. The Irish are trying to push the Vikings out. And Wolf the Quarrelsome leads the Irish army, and they win the battle. But as the Vikings are fleeing the field, they come across the camp of the King of Ireland. His name is Brian Boru. The harp on the Guinness can is the Brian Boru harp. It's his harp. So they find him, and they murder him in his camp. And so Wolf wins the battle, and he comes back. He finds that his brother and his king are dead, and he swears revenge. So he takes a group of guys, and he goes and finds the Viking band that did this. The guy's name was Brodir of Man. He finds Brodir, kills all of his guys, cuts open his stomach with an axe, pulls out his small intestine, ties it to a tree, and then makes him walk around a tree until he dies. Then he disappears from history. We don't know anything about this guy other than this story. He wins this battle, and then he executes this guy in this very specific and very graphic manner. And this is the kind of story where this guy doesn't really contribute a lot to history, right? He gets half a line, maybe a line when you're reading about the history of the Vikings in Ireland. Most places don't even mention him. But that's the kind of story where, like, you know, I'll be reading it, and then it'll be like, and then you cut this guy's belly, and then you go to the next page, and you're like, wait, what?
Well,
what was that? What's the story? I want to know more about this. So I love, like, I won't name him my most favorite historical figure of all time, but that's the story that I like, right? I like, okay, well, we could parse this out, right? What would he have been like? What kind of gear would he have carried? What kind of weapon would he have had? Like, what's the world that he was living in? Can I get 2 pages on this guy and talk about him and get a little bit of perspective onto like who he was, who the guy he was fighting was, who the brother was, right? Maybe I can do something with this and really dig in and get this story, because this guy is like he's kind of an anomaly. He just shows up, kills a guy. That's the only thing he did in history, but it's such a cool story that I want to learn about it. So I like those unsung heroes like that. I don't even know if he counts as a hero, but I like the unsung figures of history.
Definitely. How incredible to be able to kind of like put together, kind of do that sleuthing to figure out what his life might have been like and all of the characters that surround him.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I enjoy it, right? It's fun.
Ben,
There's other characters who just have just volumes and volumes and volumes written about them, and they're fun, right? They're great stories, right? If they weren't, they wouldn't have this much paper devoted to them. But I like finding those. I call it like panning for gold, where you're just reading the story and you're digging for the gold nugget, and you're just like, this is it. This guy, I got to find out about him.
Well, that's the fun part about being a historian and doing all of the research and like putting all of this information together, is finding those little nuggets, right?
Yeah, exactly. I love it.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I think Len is going to share some of the links to all of your different series, to your website. So be sure that you follow Ben, and then we'll definitely be sure to have him back again, hopefully it's in person next time. We don't have to do as many more of these virtual programs, but in the meantime, we still have you covered for virtual programming. We will be doing our next Washington Stay Home Society program next Thursday. Be sure to join us at 6 p.m. on June 4th. We're going to be preparing for the National Women's Suffrage Centennial, which Ben kind of mentioned, all of these incredible suffragists and how ahead of our time Washington State was. But we're going to be joined by Elisa Law, who's our State Suffrage Centennial Coordinator with Washington State Historical Society. And she's going to be focused on talking about collage as an art form to share in history, and featuring the Northwest Collage Society's exhibition about suffrage. So be sure to join us for that live here next week. And if you enjoyed this program, please consider donating. We have the link right there. You can just mention that you attended one of our Washington Stay Home Society programs, or specifically that you enjoyed Ben's program in particular. And we can't wait to see you again next time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again. Goodbye, everybody.